Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she carefully disassembled another rifle in the armory. The hot afternoon sun streamed through the small windows of the military base, making the already stuffy room feel like an oven. She had been working as a civilian contractor for 6 months now, cleaning and maintaining weapons for the soldiers stationed at Forward Operating Base Eagle in Afghanistan. At 24, Sarah was one of the few women working in the armory. Most of the soldiers treated her with basic respect, but there was always that group of guys who seemed to think her presence was some kind of joke. Today was no different. "Hey, cleaning lady," called out Sergeant Mike Reynolds as he walked into the armory with 2 of his buddies. "Make sure you get all the dirt out of my rifle. I need it spotless for inspection tomorrow." Sarah looked up from the weapon she was working on. Reynolds was known around the base for his arrogant attitude and his belief that women had no place in combat zones. He was a decent shot himself, having scored well in marksmanship training, but his ego was bigger than his actual skills. "It'll be ready when it's ready, Sergeant," Sarah replied calmly, not looking up from her work. She had learned early on that engaging with Reynolds only encouraged his behavior. "Whoa, did you hear that attitude?" Reynolds laughed, turning to his friends. "Maybe we should teach the cleaning girl some manners." Private Johnson, one of Reynolds' followers, chimed in. "I bet she doesn't even know which end of the rifle the bullets come out of." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she continued her work. She methodically cleaned each part of the rifle, checking for wear and damage. Her movements were precise and efficient, the result of months of practice and something deeper that the soldiers didn't know about. What they didn't realize was that Sarah wasn't just some random civilian who had stumbled into this job. Back home in Texas, she had grown up on her grandfather's ranch, where hunting was a way of life. Her grandfather, a former Marine sniper from Vietnam, had taught her to shoot when she was just 8 years old. By the time she was 16, she could hit a target at 1,000 meters consistently. "You know what I think?" Reynolds continued, his voice getting louder and more mocking. "I think our little cleaning girl here probably couldn't hit the broadside of a barn if she was standing inside it." His friends laughed, and a few other soldiers in the area started paying attention to the commotion. Sarah's hands stilled on the rifle for just a moment before she resumed her work. "Matter of fact," Reynolds said, warming up to his audience, "I bet she's never even fired a weapon in her life. Probably scared of the noise they make." Sarah finished cleaning the rifle and began reassembling it with quick, practiced movements. Her fingers moved over the weapon like she had done this thousands of times before, which she had. Every piece clicked into place perfectly, and she completed the assembly faster than most of the soldiers could manage. "Look at that," Reynolds said mockingly. "She could put a gun back together. Probably learned it from watching YouTube videos." Private Martinez, a young soldier who had always been kind to Sarah, stepped forward. "Come on, Sarge. Leave her alone. She's just doing her job." "Nobody asked you, Martinez," Reynolds snapped. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Women don't belong around weapons. They belong in kitchens or maybe hospitals, taking care of people. This whole equal opportunity thing is just political correctness gone wrong." Sarah stood up slowly, the reassembled rifle in her hands. She looked directly at Reynolds for the first time since he had entered the armory. Her dark eyes were calm, but there was something in them that made a few of the smarter soldiers take a step back. "Is that what you really think, Sergeant?" she asked quietly. Reynolds mistook her quiet tone for weakness. "That's exactly what I think, sweetheart. And I think most of the guys here would agree with me, even if they're too politically correct to say it out loud." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words. She walked over to the weapons rack and carefully placed the rifle in its designated spot. Then, she turned back to face the group of soldiers who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "You know, Sergeant Reynolds," she said, her voice still calm and measured, "my grandfather used to tell me that the loudest person in the room is usually the most insecure about their abilities." A few of the soldiers chuckled, but quickly stopped when Reynolds shot them angry looks. "What's that supposed to mean?" Reynolds demanded. "It means that maybe instead of running your mouth about what women can and can't do, you should focus on improving your own skills," Sarah replied. "I've seen your range scores. They're not exactly impressive." The room went dead silent. Reynolds' face turned red with anger and embarrassment. His range scores were a sore subject for him, as he had barely qualified on his last assessment. "You want to run your mouth about my shooting?" Reynolds snarled. "Fine. Let's settle this right now. You and me, shooting competition. Let's see who the better marksman really is." Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if considering his challenge. "What kind of competition did you have in mind?" "Standard range, 500 meters, 10 rounds each. Best grouping wins," Reynolds said confidently. He was sure he could outshoot a civilian contractor, especially a woman. "That sounds a little easy," Sarah said with a slight smile. "How about we make it more interesting? What do you have in mind?" Reynolds asked, though something in Sarah's tone made him less confident than he had been a moment before. "Long range," Sarah said simply. "Real long range. Let's see what you're really made of, Sergeant." The other soldiers began murmuring among themselves. Long-range shooting was a specialized skill that required years of training and practice. Most of them had never attempted shots beyond 800 meters, and even the base's designated marksmen rarely went beyond 1,200 meters. "How long are we talking?" Reynolds asked, trying to keep the uncertainty out of his voice. "Why don't we start with something reasonable?" Sarah said, her tone almost conversational. "Say 1,500 meters? That's not too challenging for someone with your obvious skills." Reynolds swallowed hard. He had never successfully hit a target at 1,500 meters, but he couldn't back down now, not in front of all these soldiers. His reputation would be ruined. "Fine," he said, trying to sound confident. 1,500 meters it is." Sarah nodded. "Excellent. When would you like to do this?" "Tomorrow morning," Reynolds said. "Right after PT. That'll give you time to practice tonight, if you need it." Sarah's smile widened slightly. "I don't think that'll be necessary, but thank you for your concern." As the crowd of soldiers began to disperse, word of the challenge spread quickly throughout the base. By evening, everyone knew about the shooting contest between Sergeant Reynolds and the cleaning girl from the armory. Most of the soldiers assumed it would be a quick and embarrassing defeat for Sarah. After all, Reynolds was an infantry sergeant with years of military training, while she was just a civilian contractor. But a few of the soldiers who had worked with Sarah longer noticed something that made them think twice about betting against her. They had seen the way she handled weapons. They had noticed how she could field strip and reassemble any rifle on the base faster than most trained soldiers. They had observed that she never seemed intimidated by the weapons, never hesitant or unsure in her movements. Private Martinez was one of those soldiers who had paid attention. As he lay in his bunk that night, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, the quiet woman from the armory might have a few surprises in store for the arrogant sergeant. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her small quarters, cleaning her personal rifle. It was a custom-built precision weapon that her grandfather had left her, modified over the years to her exact specifications. She had brought it with her to Afghanistan, but had never used it on base. Tomorrow might be the perfect time to introduce it to her new colleagues. As she worked, Sarah thought about her grandfather and all the lessons he had taught her. Patience, precision, and respect for the weapon, he had always said. Those are the 3 pillars of marksmanship. Master those, and distance becomes just a number. Tomorrow, she would show Sergeant Reynolds and everyone else on the base exactly what those lessons had taught her. The cleaning girl was about to become something very different indeed. The morning air was crisp and clear as soldiers gathered at the base's long-range shooting facility. Word of the challenge had spread beyond forward operating Base Eagle, and even some personnel from neighboring outposts had come to witness what many expected to be a quick humiliation of the armory contractor. Sarah arrived at the range carrying a long, hard case that most of the soldiers had never seen before. She wore simple desert camouflage pants and a plain t-shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. In contrast to the nervous energy of the crowd, she seemed completely calm and focused. Sergeant Reynolds was already at the firing line, checking his M4 rifle for the 3rd time. He had spent most of the previous evening cleaning and adjusting his weapon, trying to squeeze every bit of accuracy out of it. Several of his friends surrounded him, offering advice and encouragement, but Reynolds looked less confident than he had the day before. Captain James Morrison, the base commander, had decided to personally oversee the competition. He was curious about the contractor who had somehow managed to get under Reynolds' skin enough to provoke this challenge. Morrison had read Sarah's file when she arrived at the base, but it contained only basic information about her background and qualifications for armory work. "All right, listen up," Captain Morrison called out as the crowd gathered around. "This is still a military base, not a circus. We're going to conduct this competition professionally and safely. Range Master Sergeant Williams will oversee the technical aspects." Sergeant Williams, a grizzled veteran with over 20 years of experience, stepped forward. He had been running shooting competitions for most of his career and had seen everything from beginners to elite special forces operators. "The challenge is set for 1,500 meters, Williams announced. "Each shooter gets 5 rounds to zero their weapon, then 10 rounds for score. Best grouping wins. Standard military targets will be used." He paused and looked at both competitors. "I want to be clear about something. 1,500 meters is serious long-range shooting. It requires specialized equipment, extensive training, and perfect conditions. The slightest error in calculation, equipment, or technique will result in a complete miss." Reynolds nodded curtly, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. At 1,500 meters, his M4 would be pushed far beyond its effective range. Sarah simply opened her case and began removing her rifle. The moment the weapon came into view, the murmur of conversation around the range died down. Even from a distance, it was clear that this was not a standard military rifle. The weapon was a custom precision rifle built on a Remington 700 Action, with a heavy stainless steel barrel and a high-end tactical stock. A massive scope sat mounted on top, and every component looked like it had been carefully selected for maximum accuracy. This was the kind of rifle that cost more than most soldiers made in 6 months. "Jesus," whispered Private Martinez to the soldier standing next to him. "That's not a hunting rifle. That's a sniper rifle." Sergeant Williams walked over to inspect Sarah's weapon. His eyes widened as he took in the specifications. "Miss Martinez, can you tell me about your rifle?" "Custom-built .308 Winchester," Sarah replied matter-of-factly as she began setting up. "26-inch barrel, 110 twist rate. Schmidt and Bender scope, 5-25 power. Hand-loaded ammunition using 175-grain Sierra Match King bullets." Williams nodded slowly. He recognized top-tier precision shooting equipment when he saw it. "Have you used this rifle at 1,500 meters before?" "Many times," Sarah said simply, not elaborating further. Reynolds overheard the conversation and felt his stomach drop. He was beginning to realize that he might have seriously underestimated his opponent. But it was too late to back out now without losing face in front of the entire base. "Shooters, take your positions," Sergeant Williams called out. Reynolds set up at the first firing position, lying prone behind his M4. He was already struggling with the mathematics of the shot. At 1,500 meters, he would need to compensate for bullet drop, wind drift, and several other factors that he had only theoretical knowledge about. Sarah took her position at the adjacent firing point. She moved with practiced efficiency, setting up a bipod and adjusting her position with small, precise movements. She pulled out a small notebook and a handheld device that looked like a miniature computer. "What's all that gear?" Reynolds asked, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide his nervousness. "Ballistic calculator and range data," Sarah replied, without looking up from her notebook. "At this distance, you need to account for air density, humidity, temperature, barometric pressure, and Coriolis effect, among other things." Reynolds had heard of some of these factors, but had never calculated for them in practice. He was beginning to understand just how far out of his depth he really was. Sarah spent several minutes taking measurements with various instruments and making calculations. She consulted charts in her notebook and input data into her ballistic calculator. To the watching soldiers, it looked like she was conducting a complex scientific experiment rather than preparing for a shooting match. "Whenever you're ready," Sergeant Williams announced. "5 rounds for a zeroing, then we'll move to the competition shots." Reynolds went first, attempting to sight in his rifle for the extreme distance. His first shot was a complete miss, not even hitting the large target frame. His second and third shots hit the target frame, but missed the actual scoring area by several feet. By his fifth zeroing shot, he was hitting the outer edges of the target, but his groups were scattered across an area the size of a large dinner plate. When it was Sarah's turn, she settled behind her rifle with movements that looked almost ritual in their precision. She controlled her breathing, adjusted her position slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy rifle recoiled against her shoulder, but she rode it smoothly and immediately began cycling the bolt for her next shot. Her first shot hit within inches of the target center. Her second shot was even closer. By her fifth zeroing shot, all 5 rounds were clustered in a group that could be covered by a playing card, all of them within the high-scoring inner rings of the target. The crowd of soldiers watched in stunned silence. Many of them had never seen precision shooting at this level before. Even Sergeant Williams, who had overseen thousands of shooting competitions, was impressed by the display of skill. "Holy shit," someone whispered, before quickly looking around to make sure no officers had heard the profanity. Reynolds was sweating now, despite the cool morning air. He had qualified as a sharpshooter in the military, which meant he was better than average, but what he was witnessing was in a completely different category. This was the kind of shooting he had only heard about in stories from special operations units. "Competition phase," Sergeant Williams announced. 10 rounds for score. "Sergeant Reynolds, you're up first." Reynolds tried to calm his nerves as he settled back behind his rifle. He knew he was beaten before he started, but military pride demanded that he at least make an effort. His first competition shot missed the target entirely. The second grazed the outer edge. He managed to get 6 of his 10 rounds on target, but they were scattered across the entire scoring area with no real precision. When he finished, Reynolds stood up and stepped back from the firing line. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, but he managed to maintain military bearing. He knew that his reputation on the base would never recover from this humiliation. Sarah took her position for the competition phase. She went through the same methodical preparation routine, checking her notes and making minute adjustments to her scope. The crowd pressed closer to watch, even though they were supposed to maintain a safe distance. Her first competition shot hit dead center of the bullseye. The second shot hit so close to the first that the holes touched. By her fifth shot, she had created a group that was smaller than a quarter at 1,500 meters. Her final 5 shots continued to land in the same impossibly small area, creating what looked like a single ragged hole in the center of the target. When she finished shooting, Sarah stood and safe her rifle. The range fell completely silent except for the sound of wind across the desert. Nobody moved or spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Sergeant Williams walked downrange to officially score the targets. He carried a measuring device to determine the exact size of each group. When he returned, his expression was one of professional amazement. "Sergeant Reynolds," he announced, "your best 5 shots grouped at 18.7 inches with a total score of 47 out of 100 possible points." The crowd murmured. It wasn't terrible shooting for the distance, but it wasn't particularly impressive either. Williams turned to Sarah. "Miss Martinez, your 10 shots grouped at 2.3 inches with a perfect score of 100 points. All 10 shots were in the X-ring." The silence that followed was deafening. Several soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. A 2.3-inch group at 1,500 meters was competitive, match-winning shooting that many professional marksmen would be proud of. Captain Morrison stepped forward. "Miss Martinez, where exactly did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah shouldered her rifle and began packing her equipment. "My grandfather taught me, sir. He was a Marine sniper in Vietnam." "What was your grandfather's name?" Morrison asked. "Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Martinez, sir. 3rd Marine Division." Morrison's eyes widened. He had heard of Carlos Martinez. The man was legendary in Marine sniper circles, credited with over 80 confirmed kills during his tours in Vietnam. He had been one of the deadliest snipers in Marine Corps history. Well, Morrison said after a moment, I think we all learned something today. As the crowd began to disperse, Reynolds approached Sarah. His face was still red, but his expression had changed from anger to something approaching respect. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I was completely out of line yesterday. Sarah looked at him for a moment before nodding. Apology accepted, Sergeant. We all make mistakes. Where did you really learn to shoot like that? Reynolds asked. That wasn't just hunting with Grandpa. Sarah finished packing her rifle and closed the case. Actually, it was. My grandfather believed that if you were going to do something, you should do it right. He spent 15 years teaching me everything he knew about precision shooting. Every weekend, every vacation, every spare moment we had. She shouldered her rifle case and started to walk away, then paused and looked back at Reynolds. Sergeant, can I give you some advice? The next time you want to challenge someone, maybe ask about their background first. You might save yourself some embarrassment. As Sarah walked away, the remaining soldiers continued to stare after her. The quiet woman who cleaned rifles in the armory had just demonstrated that she was one of the most skilled marksmen any of them had ever seen. But none of them had any idea that what they had just witnessed was only a small sample of her real capabilities. 3 weeks had passed since the shooting competition, and life at Forward Operating Base Eagle had settled into a new routine. Word of Sarah's incredible marksmanship had spread throughout the military community in the region, and she found herself treated with a level of respect that hadn't existed before. Soldiers who had previously ignored her now nodded politely when she passed, and even Sergeant Reynolds had become unexpectedly courteous. Captain Morrison had quietly moved Sarah from general armory duties to specialized weapons maintenance, recognizing that her skills were being wasted on basic rifle cleaning. She now worked on the base's precision rifles and specialized equipment, a role that better matched her obvious expertise. On this particular morning, Sarah was working on a Barrett M82 anti-material rifle when alarms began sounding throughout the base. She looked up from her work as soldiers ran past the armory windows, heading toward defensive positions. Within minutes, Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the base intercom. All personnel to defensive positions. We have enemy activity on Ridge 7. This is not a drill. Sarah secured the weapons she was working on and moved toward the armory's reinforced window to see what was happening. Ridge 7 was a mountainous position approximately 4 kilometers northeast of the base, well beyond the range of most infantry weapons, but perfect for enemy observation and mortar attacks. Through her window, Sarah could see soldiers manning the base's perimeter defenses while others set up crew-served weapons and called for air support. The enemy had chosen their position well. Ridge 7 provided excellent cover and multiple escape routes while offering clear lines of sight to the base. Lieutenant Colonel Bradley, the base's intelligence officer, burst into the armory looking for Captain Morrison. When he saw Sarah instead, he started to leave, then stopped and looked at her more carefully. You're Martinez, right? The one who outshot Reynolds at 1,500 meters? Yes, sir, Sarah replied. I need to find Captain Morrison immediately. We have enemy spotters on Ridge 7 calling in mortar coordinates. They're too far away for our standard weapons, and air support is 20 minutes out. We need to neutralize those spotters before they can direct effective fire on the base. Sarah glanced out the window toward the distant ridge. Even with binoculars, she could barely make out movement on the rocky outcropping. How far is Ridge 7, sir? Just over 4,000 meters, Bradley replied grimly. Why do you ask? Sarah was quiet for a moment, calculating distances and possibilities in her head. Sir, what if I told you I might be able to help with those spotters? Bradley looked at her skeptically. Help how? You're a civilian contractor. I'm a civilian contractor who can shoot, sir. Very well. Before Bradley could respond, Captain Morrison entered the armory. His face was tight with stress as he assessed the tactical situation. Bradley, what's our status? Enemy spotters on Ridge 7 are directing mortar fire. They've got perfect overwatch of our position, and they're just far enough away that we can't touch them with anything we have. Air support is still 15 minutes out, and the mortars are getting more accurate with each salvo. Morrison cursed under his breath. Options? Limited, sir. We can try to suppress them with our .50 caliber positions, but 4,000 meters is well beyond effective range. We're basically stuck until air support arrives. Sarah stepped forward. Captain Morrison, permission to speak, sir. Morrison looked at her with surprise. What is it, Martinez? Sir, I believe I can neutralize the enemy spotters from here. Morrison stared at her. From here? Martinez, that's over 4,000 meters. That's an impossible shot. Not impossible, sir. Difficult, but not impossible. Lieutenant-Colonel Bradley interrupted. Captain, with all due respect, this is not the time for games. We have a serious tactical situation here. Sir, Sarah said, addressing Morrison directly. 3 weeks ago, you saw me group 10 shots in 2.3 inches at 1,500 meters. I can make longer shots than that. Much longer. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing options. Another mortar round exploded near the base perimeter, closer than the previous ones. The enemy spotters were definitely adjusting their fire. What would you need? Morrison asked finally. Access to the base's highest observation tower, my rifle, and about 10 minutes to calculate the shot, Sarah replied without hesitation. Martinez, even if you could make that shot, and I'm not saying you can, we're talking about taking human lives. You're a civilian. Sarah's expression became serious. Sir, those spotters are directing fire at American soldiers. My grandfather didn't teach me to shoot so I could win competitions. He taught me to protect people when it mattered. Another mortar round landed, this one close enough to rattle the armory windows. Morrison made his decision. Bradley, escort Martinez to Tower 3. Give her whatever support she needs. Sir, this is highly irregular, Bradley protested. So, is getting overrun by enemy mortars? Morrison snapped. Move. Sarah ran to her quarters and retrieved her rifle case while Lieutenant Colonel Bradley waited impatiently outside. When she emerged, they jogged together toward Tower 3, the base's tallest observation post. Tower 3 was a 4-story concrete structure designed to provide overwatch of the surrounding area. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah could hear more mortar rounds impacting around the base. The enemy was definitely getting more accurate. At the top of the tower, Sarah found Corporal Johnson manning an observation post with high-powered spotting scopes. The young soldier looked surprised to see a civilian contractor arriving with the base's intelligence officer. Johnson, Miss Martinez needs to use this position for a precision shot, Bradley explained. Give her whatever assistance she requires. Sarah set up her rifle quickly, using the tower's built-in shooting rest. She pulled out her notebook and ballistic calculator, then began taking measurements with her various instruments. The distance was extreme, even by her standards. Through Johnson's spotting scope, she could see the enemy position on Ridge 7. 2 figures were clearly visible, one operating what appeared to be a radio, while the other used binoculars to observe the base. They had chosen a position that provided excellent cover while giving them clear lines of sight for directing mortar fire. Distance is 4,140 meters, Sarah announced after taking careful measurements. Wind is variable, approximately 8 to 12 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity is low. She began making calculations, factoring in air density, barometric pressure, and the Coriolis effect that would deflect her bullet over such an extreme distance. At 4,140 meters, she would need to aim approximately 30 feet high and 6 feet to the right of her target to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift. This is insane, Bradley muttered as he watched her work. Even if you could hit something at that distance, which is physically impossible, how do you know you won't hit civilians or friendly forces? Because I can see exactly what I'm shooting at through my scope, and I know my capabilities, Sarah replied calmly. She had finished her calculations and was now adjusting her scope's turrets to compensate for the extreme distance. Through her rifle scope, She could see the enemy spotters clearly. They were definitely military personnel, armed and actively engaged in directing mortar fire at the base. As she watched, one of them spoke into his radio, and seconds later, another mortar round impacted near the base's motor pool. "Johnson, can you spot for me?" Sarah asked. The young corporal looked uncertain. "Ma'am, I don't know anything about spotting for long-range shooting. Just watch through your scope and tell me where my bullet impacts relative to the target," Sarah explained. "I may need to make an adjustment for a follow-up shot." Sarah settled behind her rifle, controlling her breathing and heart rate. At this distance, the slightest error would result in a complete miss. She had to account not just for the ballistic factor she had calculated, but also for the movement of the Earth itself due to its rotation. The shot she was attempting was at the very edge of what was possible with small arms. Only a handful of snipers in military history had successfully engaged targets at ranges exceeding 4,000 meters, and those shots had typically been taken under perfect conditions with extensive preparation. But Sarah had advantages that most snipers didn't possess. Her grandfather had been obsessed with extreme long-range shooting, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with precision rifles. He had taught her not just the mechanics of marksmanship, but the almost mystical level of focus and calculation required for shots that seemed impossible. She could feel her heartbeat slowing as she entered the state of concentration her grandfather had called the zone. Everything except the target, and the shot disappeared from her consciousness. Wind direction, bullet trajectory, target movement, and a dozen other variables became part of a complex equation that her trained mind solved automatically. Through her scope, she could see one of the enemy spotters clearly. He was standing partially exposed as he used his binoculars to observe the base. It was a perfect target presentation for the shot she needed to make. Sarah took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held. She placed her crosshairs exactly where her calculations told her to aim, accounting for the bullet's long arc through the desert air. Her finger found the trigger and began applying steady pressure. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the tower walls. The heavy bullet began its nearly 5-second flight toward Ridge 7, arcing high above the desert floor before beginning its descent toward the target. Through his spotting scope, Corporal Johnson watched the distant ridge intently. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, one of the enemy figures dropped from sight. "Hit!" Johnson shouted. Direct hit on the primary target. Sarah was already cycling her bolt and searching for the second spotter through her scope. The second enemy soldier had taken cover behind rocks, but she could still see part of his position. She made a slight adjustment to her scope and settled in for a follow-up shot. The second shot was even more challenging because the target was now partially concealed and aware that he was under fire. But Sarah's calculations had been perfect for the range and conditions. She placed her crosshairs on the visible portion of the target and squeezed the trigger again. 5 seconds later, Johnson confirmed the second hit. "Both targets down. I can't see any movement on the ridge." Within minutes, the mortar fire directed at the base ceased completely. The enemy spotters who had been calling in coordinates were no longer able to do so. Air support arrived shortly afterward and confirmed that the threat had been neutralized. Captain Morrison arrived at Tower 3 just as Sarah was packing up her rifle. His expression was one of amazement and disbelief. "Martinez, did you just make 2 successful shots at over 4,000 meters?" 4,140 meters, sir," Sarah corrected. Both targets confirmed down. Morrison shook his head slowly. "That's impossible. The current world record for a confirmed sniper kill is 3,540 meters. You just exceeded that by 600 meters. Sarah shouldered her rifle case. "Sir, records are made to be broken. My grandfather always said that impossible is just another word for something nobody has figured out how to do yet." As word of the incredible shots spread throughout the base, soldiers gathered around Tower 3 to stare up at the position where Sarah had fired from. Many of them could barely see Ridge 7 with binoculars, Yet somehow the quiet woman from the armory had successfully engaged targets at that distance with precision rifle fire. Later that evening, Captain Morrison sat in his office writing his after-action report. How do you explain in official military language that a civilian contractor had just made what was possibly the longest confirmed sniper shot in history? How do you document that a woman who had been cleaning rifles 3 weeks ago had single-handedly neutralized an enemy observation post that had been directing accurate mortar fire at your base? The truth was almost too incredible to believe, but Morrison had witnessed it himself. Sarah Martinez, the granddaughter of a legendary Marine sniper, had inherited not just her grandfather's rifle and his knowledge, but his almost supernatural ability to make impossible shots when they mattered most. The cleaning girl who had been mocked for her gender and her civilian status had proven herself to be one of the most skilled marksmen anyone on the base had ever seen. And in doing so, she had saved lives and neutralized a significant threat to forward operating Base Eagle. From that day forward, nobody ever questioned Sarah's place at the base again. She had earned the respect of every soldier present through the most definitive demonstration possible. The woman who cleaned rifles had shown that she could also use them better than almost anyone alive. Word of the 4,140-meter shots would eventually reach military sniper schools and precision shooting competitions around the world. But for Sarah, the recognition was less important than the knowledge that she had honored her grandfather's memory and used his teachings to protect American soldiers when it mattered most. The impossible shot had become possible through a combination of exceptional skill, perfect preparation, and the kind of courage that refuses to accept limitations when lives are at stake. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, a legend had been born from the barrel of a precision rifle in the hands of an extraordinary woman who had learned to shoot from the very best.